Failure is something that video games are no stranger to. In fact, it seems that almost every other week a new major video game gets released, and within months it gets shut down, having been declared a failure for not bringing in enough money. But what happens when it isn't the video game that fails, but the console it was being played on? It's something that doesn't happen very often, but at the same time it also happens a lot more often than you might initially expect. Throughout the entirety of the 1990s, there was just a constant barrage of consoles coming out, failing to meet any sort of market share just because companies just kind of wanted a piece of the pie. They weren't really offering anything unique. Consoles like the Apple Pippin, the Philips CDI, the 3DO, they all came out. They weren't interesting though, didn't have any interesting games on them. Sure, they might have had the odd port or two, but there's not really a whole lot to say about them. I want to look at some consoles that do have a lot to say about them. I want to have a look at some consoles that have stories behind them. They didn't just fail because they weren't interesting. These were consoles that were interesting and failed for other reasons. And the first of these consoles that we'll be taking a look at launched only as recently as 2019. So what happened to Google Stadia? Back in 2019, after years of speculation, Google finally decided to throw their hat in the ring and launch their own game console. Kinda. Google Stadia wasn't a game console in the traditional sense. In fact, technically, Google Stadia wasn't a game console at all. Stadia was a game streaming service that would live stream the games to whatever device you wanted to play them on. Stadia was first revealed to the world at the 2019 Game Developers Conference with its own dedicated showcase, and honestly, things actually got off to a pretty good start. Google did an excellent job at showing off new features that could really only be done via streaming. Things like being able to just simply click a link in a YouTube video and instantly start playing that game. The fact that multiplayer lag isn't really that much of an issue when all the players are on the same server anyway. And one of my personal favourites is being able to share save states with just a simple link that you can send to your friends on Discord, which your friends could then play instantly. Everything looked pretty promising, but there were still some concerns. Google themselves have a reputation for releasing products and then just abandoning them not long after. So no matter what, people were always going to be skeptical of anything Google released. But there was also the fact that Stadia is not the first game streaming service to release. OnLive was another streaming service similar to Stadia that allowed people to stream games to whatever screens would allow it, all the way back in 2010. But that shut down about 2 years later. People reported issues like video compression would make games look worse, and input lag would make them feel worse to play. At its best, the game streaming was just kind of okay at this point, but almost 10 years had passed. Streaming technology was considerably better, and Google had significantly more resources than OnLive ever had access to. So people were already skeptical of game streaming. People were already skeptical of Google. Google have a reputation for launching services, only to abandon them shortly after. So it was a little bit of an uphill battle, but also we didn't actually know what games would be coming to Stadia outside of a very small handful. So just a few months later in June, Google decided to address that and spent 30 minutes showcasing what we could expect to play on Stadia. The first of which was the announcement of Baldur's Gate 3. Yes, that Baldur's Gate 3. This wasn't just Google announcing that Baldur's Gate 3 would be coming to Stadia. This is how that game was first announced. So, they kind of came out swinging. But after Baldur's Gate, there wasn't really anything noteworthy to discuss. Destiny 2 was coming to Stadia. A bunch of Ubisoft games were coming to Stadia. but we could already play those games on the consoles and the PCs that we already have. The only exclusive that Stadia would launch with was Guilt, a horror game with a small scope, which made it a little bit too niche to really be the only exclusive. Even Baldur's Gate wasn't exclusive, it wasn't even a timed exclusive, and Google's first internal game studio didn't even open until a few weeks before the service launched, so their first game was at least a few years away. This showcase is also when we first heard about the pricing model that Stadia would use. When you purchased the game on Stadia, you were paying the same price that you would pay on any other service or console, for a game that you could only access as long as the servers remained up and as long as you had an internet connection. This confused a lot of people. People kind of expected Stadia to work a lot more like how something like Game Pass or Netflix does, where you pay a monthly fee and you get access to an ongoing library. There was a subscription service available named Stadia Pro, but that just gave you a few games per month and higher streaming quality. On top of that, Stadia wasn't going to be available to everyone when it launched in November. To access it at launch, you had to buy the Founders Edition for $129. This came with the Stadia controller, a Chromecast Ultra so you could stream it to your TV, and 3 months of Stadia Pro, which would get you Destiny 2 and all of its current DLC on day one. After the first 3 months, Stadia Pro would cost around $10 a month. If you're confused at this point, don't worry. Everyone else was as well. Everything around Stadia's pricing model just made people feel apprehensive at best, and at worst, they didn't even know what they would be paying for. So why don't we take a look at what actually happened when Stadia finally launched in November of 2019. Stadia functioned, but not quite as well as people hoped. The issue with game streaming is that you need pretty fast internet for it to be decent, let alone good, and a lot of people just don't have access to that, be it for financial reasons or it just simply not being available where they live. So whilst some people were getting a near flawless experience, a lot of people were getting issues like heavy input lag, video compression, the stream buffering. Stadia worked, but not well enough to be most people's preferred way to play video games. It wasn't all bad. The Stadia controller was praised as a solid controller. What was interesting about it was how it didn't connect to your device to send inputs via your PC or your phone. It connected directly to Stadia's servers over Wi-Fi to try and help lower the input lag. But that didn't stop people from experiencing it. It didn't stop people from feeling like the service was more of a beta than a finished product. Most of the features that the service was promoted with, like share states, weren't even available at launch, so you weren't even getting the major benefits of a cloud gaming service. It was just a way to play existing games with a less consistent quality. Google's lack of post-launch communication also didn't help much, as they just weren't providing enough updates on new content and features. The bulk of their updates were dedicated to revealing what games would be included with Stadia Pro each month. To be fair, these were mostly good games. They started off with Destiny 2 and Samurai Showdown. The second month had the Tomb Raider reboot and Farming Simulator. Later games to be included were still heavy hitters like Metro Exodus, Elder Scrolls Online, Celeste. There really weren't many disappointments in this regard. Sure, some months you might get some games that aren't really your cup of tea, but that's just an issue inherent to streaming services as a whole. But what happens when you actually want to buy a game on Stadia? What happens when you're sick of playing Destiny 2 or some other game that you got included with your Stadia Pro subscription? Surely you can just press a button, open the store and buy them, right? Right? At launch, the only way you could buy games on Stadia was via the mobile app. So, unless you were playing on mobile, you'd have to download the app, buy the game, then go back to your PC or television and start playing there. This didn't really represent the convenience that streaming is supposed to offer. It would be addressed eventually, in fact many of the service's issues would be, but the streaming quality itself was something that Google could only control so far. If your internet just couldn't cut it, then tough. But one thing that Google could address was the game lineup with their first-party releases. Not a single first-party game was released on Stadia. In fact, in February 2021, just over a year after the service launched, Google closed all of their internal development studios. A huge batch of Stadia's executives left. And Google tried to tell people that Stadia was still alive and well, that stuff would be coming, more games would be coming, but their actions didn't really back that statement up. Everyone could see the writing on the wall. It was now just a matter of waiting. Existing games would slowly trickle to the platform over the next year or two, but people just weren't really interested in a game streaming service, especially when the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series consoles were still so fresh and elusive in people's minds. So eventually, on September 29th, 2022, due to low sales and subscription numbers, Google announced that Stadia would be shutting down on January 18th, 2023. Every game and piece of hardware purchased would be fully refunded, and many games even offered save transfers to other platforms so people could just keep playing like normal. But people still had their Stadia controllers, and these connected to Stadia servers over Wi-Fi, so were these just useless now? Well, luckily, Google released a way to update their Stadia controllers so that you could turn them to just a standard Bluetooth controller. So whilst I can't test how Stadia plays now, I can at least test how the controller feels. I tested the Stadia controller on the following games, and every single one had full functionality as if it were just a standard Xbox controller. There isn't really much more to say about it on that regard, it's a good controller. I even managed to beat a seaside stage on Celeste using just the D-pad. For all of Stadia's faults, the team did a really nice job with this. Looking back, Stadia probably launched at the best point in history that it could have done. People were about to be spending a lot more time indoors due to COVID, and a lot of them were buying new game consoles so that they'd have something to do whilst they were stuck at home. With Stadia, they could just buy the games without having to spend several $100s on a console. But this wasn't really capitalised on. Instead, Google just remained pretty quiet on Stadia as a whole. It was like they'd given up when it had a fairly slow start, and didn't even consider the golden opportunity they had before them. The average person hadn't even heard of Stadia, and those who had didn't really know what it was. If the marketing was clearer, Google could have easily got thousands, maybe millions of people playing games on Stadia over lockdown instead of buying new consoles. Free-to-play games could have thrived here. With streaming, you could just play any free-to-play game instantly. With the Epic vs Apple lawsuit removing Fortnite from iOS later in 2020, Stadia could have easily offered iPhone users the chance to keep playing, but it just didn't. Stadia did implement game demos later on, but considering the tech is going to be very hit or miss for people, it probably should have been there from the start. By the time you were able to make the argument that Stadia was a good service, it just didn't have the content to back that up. And even then, there's just the fact that people don't really care about cloud gaming. If you look at the successful cloud gaming services, Amazon Luna, GeForce Now, Xbox Cloud Streaming, people aren't paying to just get cloud streaming except from GeForce Now. But even then they're paying for access to games they already own. Nobody wants to be restricted to playing their games via the cloud. The cloud is just a nice option to have. And realistically, that's all it's ever going to be. Nobody wants to be restricted to playing their games on the cloud. They want it as a nice option to have for maybe when they're travelling, or their PC is broken, or something else. Cloud gaming is just too inconsistent to ever really compete with consoles. But what happens when something comes out that isn't trying to compete with consoles, but replace them entirely? The Ouya is a very weird thing to look back on. Beginning its life as a Kickstarter project back in 2012, it made $2 million in its first day, ending the campaign with over $8.5 million. This makes it one of the most successful Kickstarter campaigns in history. But what even is it? Well, the Ouya is what was commonly referred to as a micro-console, which was like a game console but smaller, cheaper and not as powerful. These were a trend that started and mostly ended in the early 2010s, with similar devices like the Nvidia Shield TV and Sony even trying it out with the PlayStation TV. The main point of them was that you would use them to play mobile games on your TV, in case you didn't have a phone, even though everyone had phones in 2013. This was around the time when major publishers were absolutely convinced that mobile gaming was going to be the future, all because someone's uncle spent $10,000 on Farmville, and that just couldn't be done on the Xbox. Unfortunately, it turns out that could be done on the Xbox. It's just that major publishers hadn't really figured that out yet, and so they brought in micro consoles to try and bridge the gap. But what made the Ouya stand out amongst the other micro consoles? Well, for one, it ran on Android and was made with cheap off-the-shelf parts, making it relatively easy to develop for. In fact, this was one of the Ouya's biggest selling points, including the fact that any Ouya could easily be hacked for all sorts of homebrew potential. There was actually a decent amount of interest from developers as well, including some pretty big names like Sega and Square Enix. In fact, the lead up to launch as a whole went relatively smoothly. Kickstarter backers got their consoles around April of 2013, with the full launch set for June of that same year. The Ouya launched to not great reception. People liked that the games on the Ouya store required some form of demo or free-to-play aspect, but this just made for extra steps for developers when publishing their games. There was also the matter of the controller. Holding it for myself, it doesn't feel uncomfortable to hold, but the buttons all feel cheap and unrefined, especially the D-pad and triggers. There's also the issue of the controller using two AA batteries, but to insert them you need to remove these faceplates from the front. Taking these off is a task in and of itself. They're on here so tight that it feels like you're going to snap them in half whenever you just need to change the batteries. But what about the games themselves? Well, you had a bunch of mobile games, and that was mostly it. There were some good games on Ouya: Final Fantasy III, the Christian Whitehead version of Sonic CD, and a couple of exclusives, at least at the time. In fact, the Ouya's highest selling game was Towerfall, which was later ported to other platforms as Towerfall Ascension, which you might know as the first game by the team behind Celeste. So without Ouya, we may have never gotten Celeste, one of the biggest 2D platformers of the past decade. But also, Towerfall, the highest selling game on the console, only sold 7,000 copies. Given that the Ouya sold around 200,000 units, 7,000 sales for its best-selling game is kind of pathetic. It became clear pretty much instantly that people just didn't really care about a little box dedicated to bite-sized games. especially not when the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One were coming out in just a few months afterwards. Any noise that the Ouya made, good or bad, was just being drowned out by the bigger, better, and frankly, more interesting hardware that was coming up. They tried bringing more developers to the platform, but it just wasn't a good prospect. So the Ouya faded into obscurity before being purchased and discontinued by Razer in 2015, with the store and accounts shutting down in 2019. Which means that when I tried to set up my Ouya, all I got was this. So Ouyas are now basically paperweights. Unless you hack them. Ouya has a small but pretty dedicated fan community that's still active to this day. You can just plug this thing into a PC, connect it to the fan server, and access almost all of the games that ever launched on the Ouya for free. There are even fans still developing games for it to this day. Every few months there seems to be a game jam happening, and people make games for the Ouya, and that's actually really nice to see that a community has formed around this and they are getting to just make things for it. So thanks to the people dedicated to keeping this thing alive. Let's take a look at some of what the Ouya has to offer. Starting off with Towerfall, it's a pretty fun multiplayer game where you have to shoot your opponents with arrows in a 2D arena. This is a case of the game being good, but the controls being let down by the controller. You need to be dashing a lot, but the dash is mapped to the triggers, which just feel horrible to press. They're weirdly stiff, and they feel like your finger will just slide off at any minute, so just play this on other consoles. Next up is Cat Lateral Damage, a game in which you play as a cat with the goal of ruining your owner's apartment. It's actually quite a fun premise. It works well for short bursts of gameplay, but the Ouya seems to struggle a lot with 3D visuals, and the visuals here already aren't exactly great, or even good. It feels like they had to cut a lot back just to get it running on the console, and it still doesn't really run very well. Moving on to Amazing Frog, probably one of Ouya's biggest exclusives. Imagine if Goat Simulator was frog-based, and also ran terribly, and also was terrible. I don't really have anything else to add here. It did release before Goat Simulator, so no one can accuse it of being a copycat, but we also can't accuse it of being good. I also played the Android port of Sonic 1 on here, which was actually my first time ever beating Sonic 1, and I don't know how to feel about that. I guess the game ran well enough, so it's got that going for it. Same for the other Sonic games on here, but they are just the Sonic games. It really isn't difficult to see why the Ouya failed. It pretty much tried to capitalise on a niche that never actually existed in the first place. Combined with how cheap and low quality everything around it felt, and how it didn't really have any games worth playing that were exclusive to it, its entire existence just kind of feels pointless. Also, fun fact, I actually bought 2 of these things. Back in November, I ordered one just because I wanted one, not even for this video, I just wanted one. It was the limited edition bronze Ouya that was only given to Kickstarter backers, and it never arrived. So I've probably spent more money on Ouyas than anyone else in human history, because I've bought 2. And was it worth it? Absolutely not, no. Not in the slightest. But I just wanted it. I wanted one for a while because failed consoles fascinate me. So I just wanted an Ouya. but not as much as I wanted this thing. I fucking love this absolute piece of shit. Whenever anybody tells you that something is physically painful to play, they are exaggerating. Unless it was on the Virtual Boy. The Virtual Boy is probably Nintendo's biggest failure since they started making video games. It was released all the way back in 1995, and it was their attempt at bringing virtual reality to the common man. Except the technology wasn't really there yet. In fact, it wasn't even close. The Virtual Boy had no head tracking or gyro at all. You would have to play it on this weird stand which you couldn't even adjust the height of. The only colours the screen could display were black and 3 different shades of red, and that screen would begin to induce eye strain after around 15 minutes of use. But you might not even last that long anyway because of how you have to sit to even use this thing. Are you starting to see why this thing failed? At least the controller is actually quite nice. Not many games really made use of the dual D-pads, and it can be confusing to tell which buttons are which at first. I feel like this could have really benefited from the symbols being embossed into the buttons themselves. It feels good to hold, but it also feels like a prototype too. On top of all of that, Nintendo tried to market this thing as a portable console. Despite this, they sold it for $180 US, which was about $50 more than the Game Gear, almost $100 more than the Game Boy. And just look at this thing. This is huge. In what world is this portable? Even the Switch 2, like, kind of fits in my pocket. The Joy-Cons get caught a little, but it fits. It's not fucking happening. So with the high price points, how impractical it is to use, and the fact that it literally hurts to play, do the games even matter at that point? Yes. Yes, they do. And I have a few to take a look at. So let's begin with the first one, the console's pack-in title, Mario's Tennis. The first entry in the Mario Tennis series has all the tennis you would expect from a game with tennis in the title. Not a whole lot of Mario though. You can play as the characters from Mario, but aside from stat differences, there's not really anything to them. It's just a very bare bones tennis game. I guess it does a good job at showing off the 3D visuals you can get with virtual reality, but it doesn't do a very good job at being a fun video game. The next game I have for my Virtual Boy is V-Tetris. It's Tetris. There's not much I can really say here. It has some nice variations, like playing on a rotating cylinder, but at its core it is still just Tetris. However, Tetris is also a great game, so I'm fine with this. The final game I have for my Virtual Boy, at least so far, is Wario Land, or Virtual Boy Wario Land to give it its full government name. This is widely considered to be the best game on the Virtual Boy, and yeah, it's pretty good. It's about Wario, funnily enough. He's on a trip to the Amazon River, where he finds the native tribe and decides he wants to steal all of their treasure. That is the actual plot of the game. Anyway, the stages are fairly open-ended, with you having to find a key to unlock a door which will let you progress to the next stage. It certainly feels like a Wario Land game, at least to me, having only played this and the first one. VB feels like a very natural evolution of that first game though, and I had a fun enough time with it that I played it all the way through to completion. I had a fun enough time with Wario Land that I was able to get all the way to the credits, but it's not really worth going through all the hassle to play the game as it was intended. And sure, it's a pretty good game on the Virtual Boy, but it being on the Virtual Boy doesn't really add anything to the experience. And that's a pattern that follows throughout the entirety of the Virtual Boy's library. The thing is that due to the system being physically painful to use, most games are only designed to be played in short 15-20 minute bursts. But in 1995, people weren't as interested in games that they would only be playing for 15 minutes at a time. People were becoming a lot more interested in large, sprawling adventures, RPGs, huge platformers. And the Virtual Boy couldn't really offer that because nobody could play them on it. So the games didn't have much appeal at the time. The console itself was a torture device. Are you starting to see why this thing failed? Nintendo has a mostly high reputation for quality consoles. Even the Wii U was put together nicely, but this was just awful. So how did the Virtual Boy even get released? Well, during the mid-90s, Nintendo were hyping up their next home console, the Nintendo 64, though that was taking a long time to actually get released. Too long, in fact. It kept getting delayed, competitors like the PlayStation and the Sega Saturn kept coming out, and Nintendo needed something to put out. So they just kinda went with this idea that they were already messing around with, and rushed it out before it was even ready. And even if they did fix the problems of the eye and the neck pain, let's face it, VR was just not an appealing prospect on 90s hardware. The Virtual Boy was doomed to fail no matter what, and it was pulled from the market only 8 months after its initial release, before it even had the chance to come out in Europe. Only 22 games ever actually released for the Virtual Boy, and 8 of those were Japan exclusive. So if you want to try and build up a full console library, the Virtual Boy isn't your worst option. The game prices typically range from between £40 and £100, at least at the time of me making this video. There are of course a few outliers. 1 or 2 games go for like £1,000 at times, but there are worse options. The Virtual Boy also has some pretty good homebrew options available. Someone ported Street Fighter 2 over, and someone even made Virtual Boy link cables, which the console supported, but they were never actually officially released. So now you can play versus matches on Street Fighter 2 on the Virtual Boy, for some reason. But if you really want to play Virtual Boy games, there is a better option. One that even lets you play them in glasses-free 3D. Back in 2024, someone with the username Red Viper released a Virtual Boy emulator that can be loaded onto a modded 3DS, meaning that you can play Virtual Boy games in 3D without all of the problems inherent to the Virtual Boy. So really, if you're just curious about what the console has to offer, just grab this instead. So that's the Virtual Boy. I fucking love this thing. I can't really explain why, it's just so fascinating. Everything about its conception and execution just never should have made it to market, and yet somehow it did. It tried to leverage technology that was like 15 years away from being tolerable, let alone good. And then when they had to scale all of that back because it would have cost too much, we're left with agony. It's a weird outlier for Nintendo, a company normally known for their pedigree and the quality of their hardware, releasing something that's just terrible. But what happens when a console isn't terrible? What happens when the console itself is good, but fails anyway? This brings us to the last console we'll be looking at today, the Sega Dreamcast. I spoke a little bit about the Sega Dreamcast in my last video, but that's 6 hours long and not everyone has the time for that, so let's just start from the top. The Dreamcast launched in 1998, starting in Japan and slowly spreading out to the rest of the world, kicking off the 6th generation of consoles. The Dreamcast was a powerhouse at the time of its release and made pretty good use of that power with games like Sonic Adventure, Soul Calibur, Power Stone, Dead or Alive, and so many more, all displaying cutting edge visuals. But what's shocking about this is that these games are widely considered to be good, and many of them were exclusive to the Dreamcast, at least at the time of their release. The Dreamcast also became the go-to console for porting arcade titles. Games like Crazy Taxi and Marvel vs. Capcom 2 played beautifully on this thing. So the games were good. We know that wasn't the problem. The hardware was powerful and had the virtual memory unit, which gave new functionality to memory cards, even acting as a sort of mini portable system. You could download games onto it that acted as companions to the titles you were already playing, which meant that you could make progress in your games even when you were away from the console. But that idea didn't really resonate with people, or most developers. So the VMU just ended up becoming something that was mostly forgotten about. It also didn't help that the batteries didn't last very long and you couldn't charge them, you'd have to replace the batteries every time. Luckily this didn't affect save data though, just using the device away from the console. So the only considerable issue with the hardware was a fairly minor one. Sure, it may have been a factor, but it can't have been the main reason why the Dreamcast failed. Well, the thing is, Sega were already on the decline when they released the Dreamcast, because their prior console was also a failure. The Sega Saturn launched in Japan in November of 1994 and was Sega's first 32-bit console. Kinda. See, the day before the Saturn launched in Japan, Sega of America launched the 32X as an add-on for the Genesis, which would allow for 32-bit graphics and even had some exclusive games of its own. This was after they had already launched the Sega CD, which had its own batch of exclusive games, so things were already a bit confusing. Add that onto an add-on that was touting it could do the same thing as your new console, and people were just left asking what the point was. To make matters worse, when it came time to release the Saturn in the West, Sega committed one of the biggest blunders in console history. They shadow dropped the console, giving retailers no notice that it was coming into stores, and giving consumers no time to figure out what it was, let alone why they should get one. And selling it at $400 was a lot of money at the time, equal to around $850 today. So, how did this even happen? Well, this was not long before Sony's PlayStation released, and a lot of hype was building up around it. Sega knew that they were going to be in for a very difficult time going up against the PlayStation, so they mandated that the Saturn had to be out first. This also meant that Sega didn't have enough time to optimize the hardware more, which meant they were selling it at $400. A couple hours after the Saturn's price was announced, Sony announced the PlayStation's price in one of the most infamous clips the gaming industry now has. So, the Saturn was fucked. It didn't really get many must-play games, aside from a few arcade ports, but this was at a time when games were moving away from the arcades, especially in the West. And Sonic Extreme, the Saturn's one Sonic game, was cancelled, so they didn't even have their mascot on the system. Looking at what we've seen of Sonic Extreme though, it was probably for the best. This game looks terrible. The Saturn ended up performing okay in Japan, but everywhere else it bombed hard, and it's not difficult to see why. But that lack of performance took Sega out of the public eye and let Sony fill in the void with the PlayStation. So Sega lost a lot of momentum and a lot of market share. Sega knew this, and so did everyone else. Before the Dreamcast even released, EA announced that they wouldn't be developing any games for it, and they probably weren't the only ones. By the time they released the Dreamcast and got their act together, most people had moved on. Again, the Dreamcast performed okay, but it still lagged behind the PlayStation, and from 2000 onwards behind the PlayStation 2. The Dreamcast was great. I love mine, but it just couldn't compete with what was going against it at the time. So in January of 2001, Sega announced that they would stop manufacturing Dreamcasts and transition to becoming a third-party publisher for their now former competitors. Definitely a difficult decision for them to have to make, but it's also kept the company surviving to this day, and some could argue they're thriving. Sega have a lot of good games at the moment. Sonic is still going alive and occasionally well. Their Yakuza series, or Like a Dragon as it's now known worldwide, is one of their best series and one of the most continually successful series in gaming at the moment. So the Dreamcast may have failed, but its legacy is still going fairly strong. I love these things. Of the consoles I've spoken about today, the only one that you could really argue is good is the Dreamcast, so why have I spent hundreds of pounds on all of this hardware? Well, I like the stories behind them. Not a single one of these just appeared out of nowhere and then faded into obscurity overnight for no reason. From the moment of their announcement, even earlier in some cases, you can see the series of events that led to its inevitable conclusion. The Ouya tried to capitalize on a niche that only existed in the minds of corporate executives. Stadia was woefully out of touch with what people wanted and expected from a streaming service, and was constantly haunted by Google's reputation, their graveyard. The Virtual Boy was just thrown together for the sake of having something on the market that year, and the Dreamcast was one last valiant hurrah from a company that knew it was all or nothing, and eventually it became nothing. The teams behind all of these tried in earnest to open people up to new experiences, new ways to engage with a medium that we love. And those ways may not have always been ideal or even good, but that doesn't mean they weren't valuable in some way. Virtual reality is now bordering on mainstream, and it's a viable option for people to create games and experiences with. Game streaming is now being used to supplement people's libraries rather than replace it. Plenty of Dreamcast games found new life on other platforms, and whether we like it or not, digital-only consoles are a thing. They're a popular option for people who want something a little bit cheaper and who prefer to download their games. I don't like how it seems as though they'll soon be the only option, but for now they are still just an option, and they're a viable one at that. These consoles may not have been good, but that doesn't mean that no good ever came of them. No doubt more consoles are going to release in the future, and undoubtedly some of them will fail. But when they do, I hope we don't just point at them and laugh, but we can look back at them and appreciate some of the things that they were trying to achieve.